One ring to rule them all. One ring to fight them. One ring to bring them all. Till the dawns. Bye.
Welcome back to today's build. I'll be your guide to this wonderful game we all love. Let's get started.
Today's deck features an army worthy of Mordor. His name is Sauron, the Dark Lord, and these are the legions of Lidless eyes.
Hang around to the end of the video to learn more about a giveaway.
Sauron is a 7/6 for 6 mana that has, oh wow, 8 abilities. This is going to be a long one, so strap in. The first ability here is to protect Sauron, and for 6 mana in these colors, yeah, I want protection. There's not a lot we can do to lean into this, but it does make removing enemy commanders marginally better than it normally would be. Just look out for instant speed sacrifice effects. Next, anytime an opponent casts a spell, we'll make an army and grow it. Again, there's not a lot that we can do to lean into this. However, it does make cards like Arcane Denial and An Offer You Can't Refuse marginally better. We don't want our opponents to be casting more spells, of course, but these counterspells were already really good, though some people are hesitant to run them because they give your opponents resources. In this case, our opponents having spells to play actually grows our own board, so we can also leverage mass bounce effects, like Baral's Expertise and Cyclonic Rift as removal that keeps our train rolling. The first time I played this deck, a turn 5 Cyclonic Rift into a turn 6 Sauron gave me a 19/19 army. I'm aware that there are people building Sauron decks that try to sacrifice an army every time this amass trigger resolves to keep replacing it with new bodies, but I want to come back to that idea after we finish talking about the other abilities. Each time an army of ours connects to a player, the ring will tempt us. Before we talk about what that means, let's first make a note about this ability. If this were any other deck with any other creature type, say for example elves, you'd obviously pack the deck with elves and elf tokens to maximize the number of these triggers. With armies, we don't have that luxury unless we lean into changelings like Taurian Mauler and Changeling Outcast. We'll also want ways to get our armies in for damage that we actually get these triggers. Next, the ring emblem. I won't go over how the ring works, you can read that for yourself here, but I do want to make some notes about the abilities it bestows. First, your ring bearer becomes legendary and gets a little bit harder to block. This ability is doing the most when our ring bearer is a non-legendary creature with low power, and when we're running effects that leverage the legendary type into more resources. Next, our ring bearer can draw and discard on attack, making a total of 2 abilities that give us these draw-discard effects, though notably with opposite timings. That last Sauron ability is doing the most when we have as few cards in hand as possible, or when the cards we discard are usable or doing even more work from the graveyard. But having fewer cards in hand subtracts from the power of the ring's draw effect, which is a little more reliable, so we'll be placing more emphasis on those cards that can be used from the graveyard than we will on being hellbent. One thing I noticed for those of you who don't want to play changelings is that there's an overlap here with the connive mechanic. Normally we get to draw and discard through the ring and our commander, while Amass distributes the counters on an army that want to get through. But effects like Mask of the Schemer or Security Bypass care about looting for counters as well, and the bypass even provides evasion for us. That's not to say that I think the deck should be built this way, only that it's an interesting connection and might be a good budget substitute for some of the cards in this deck. There are also some minor synergies with Proliferate, but I don't think any are big enough to be worth talking about. The next ability the ring has gives our ring bearer a kind of delayed super death touch, just in case they block our ring bearer lethally or unprofitably. This effect does the most work when our opponents either block with a really expensive creature, which they probably can't do because of the ring's first ability, or when they put a bunch of small blockers on our ring bearer, which we really can't do much to encourage besides lure effects, which are primarily green, except we can give a ring bearer menace, which does a really great impression of that. Lastly, the ring gives our ring bearer a 3-life swing on each opponent when it connects for damage. To help this do the most, we want ways to get through for damage, and, if possible, give double strike or extra combat steps. Since Sauron generates value over time, we'll want to get him in play ASAP, and since Sauron has 7 power and the creatures we're trying to get through for damage are the armies and not Sauron, Sauron will not be our ring bearer. Unlike the character Sauron, who wanted to be the one with the ring, the card Sauron wants his army to have it. In fact, most of these abilities care more about the army than Sauron in this context. Whew, that was a lot. So let's take this time to zoom out and get the big picture on all of this. Earlier, I noted the possibility of sacrificing our army to get a new body to sacrifice each time an opponent casts a spell. This idea has some benefits, namely we get to start over with a smaller army, so it's easier to get through for damage when that army is our ring bearer. However, this means that we have to get ring temptations from extra sources, and also doesn't account for the presence of changelings. A mass only makes a new army if we don't have one ready, so if we have changelings on the board at any time, this strategy falls flat. So we essentially have to choose between getting more of these triggers or getting more value off of those triggers. What's more though, these abilities here all snowball with each other to even greater effect when we're attacking with multiple creatures as opposed to just one. The greatest overlap here seems to reward a combat-focused axis rather than a sacrifice-focused one. So we'll be taking the changeling route instead of the aristocrat's path so as to use all parts of the buffalo. Now the fun part. The first thing that stands out to me is that these three work really well together. So I think Menace is our evasion of choice, but if we're clever, we can make a few more connections. In the builds for Optimus Prime and Calamax, we wanted to get through for damage with creatures that carried counters as well, but we didn't do it through traditional evasive abilities, we did it through board wipes. In other words, we can tie these three together if we use mass removal as a means to push damage through. The last thing I want to say is that Sauron probably makes an excellent CEDH commander as well, but we won't be building that today. The likes of Lion's Eye Diamond alone is worth more than any deck we've built on the channel, and I don't think that's worth the investment. But that is just to say, that build exists if that's something you're interested in. First, we'll be cutting the Nazgul, Sauron the White, and Gollum Patient Plotter. To be clear, we do want ring temptations, but we want those triggers attached to other effects we're already after. The closest of these to making it in was Gollum, as of its graveyard utility. But we're not an aristocrats deck, so we're not playing the sacrifice game. Next, we're cutting the Witch King of Angmar, Sauron Lord of the Rings, and Ugluk. These cards are flavorful and, dare I say it, cute, but the Witch King and Ugluk aren't doing anything we really want. Sauron actually does a lot of things we want, but none of them at a reasonable price. This kind of mana is just too much to ask for this kind of effect. Moving on, we're cutting the Amass Lords from War of the Spark. I don't see many people running these, but it's worth mentioning that we're trying to make multiple armies, and these only affect zombie tokens. Instead, we'll be leaning into much broader lords for our board. Malhor, Uruk-hai Captain, and Dreadhorde Invasion will be cut for similar reasons, though I'm really surprised Malhor shows up this much at all. It's basically just hardened scales for our armies, but he doesn't do anything else, like put counters on them himself, and we have a lot of things that need doing in this deck. The One Ring is flavorful, but not especially helpful. It doesn't amass, help damage get through, or any of the other things on our list. It's a very good card, but it's not really helping us. The Mouth of Sauron and Anger actually do kind of help us, milling and utility from the graveyard. But Haste wasn't the ability we wanted to give to our creatures, Evasion was. And Mouth really isn't contributing to our main axes of attack, so this is a lot to ask of a mill spell. Sauron the Necromancer, Reanimate, and Living Death seem like they're just in the wrong deck. It's not a Reanimator deck, it's an army deck. We're not packing a ton of creatures at all, let alone ones we want to reanimate. They're just going in the wrong direction, and Sauron is broad enough that what we need is focus. So what's our timeline? Turn 1 we'll play Changeling Outcast, Soul Ring, and Beamtown Beatstick to provide menace and make treasures to ramp into Sauron. Turn 2 we have March from the Black Gate, Nightscape Familiar, and Pentad Prism to fix us and ramp into our Dark Lord. Turn 3 we can play Black Market Connections, Aggro Constrictor, or Inherited Envelope for a Ring Temptation that can also ramp us. We can also play Grishnok, Taurian Mauler, or Relic of Legends for more of the same. Turn 4 is when we'd like to play Sauron, but it's 50-50, so if we can't, we'll play Angrath, Captain of Chaos, Visions of Ruin, or Spiteful Banditry to set up for when we do. We can also use Sauron the White Hand, Corsairs of Umbar, or Orcish Bowmasters to fortify our armies in play. One great play to watch for before you play Sauron though is Engulf the Shore. Because our armies get bigger and bigger each turn, this will typically leave our army on board while washing away enemy blockers just in time to play Sauron the next turn and watch everyone redeploy, while also, since we have an army on the field, get in for a Ring Temptation. With Sauron on the field, it's time to start digging for our key pieces, of which there are a few. We'll use Factor Fiction, Faithless Looting, and Sauron's Ransom to dig for cards while also storing useful spells in the graveyard. We can also play Stinging Study, Memory Deluge, and Ringside for more of the same. Like I said before, there are a lot of ways to win with this that the competitive among us will be familiar with, but I've heard your feedback, and so for this deck I'm trying something different. Let me know in the comments what you think. This win is not as elegant as what I'd like to put in most decks, but it's a terror to behold, and so much fun to pull off. First, we'll find a mystery card, and then either Volatile Claws or Maskwood Nexus. Arcane Adaptation is a good substitute for the Claws, since it's a little more secure, but I like the Claws better because I can find it with Summons of Saruman. Once you've made all your creatures into armies, go to combat. When your armies connect, you'll be tempted by the ring several times. Bonus points if you have a Relic of Legends in play and move your Ring Bearer around during this time to tap for mana and storm off, though it's not necessary. With all these ring temptations, Sauron will prompt us to wheel our hand that many times. When he does, we can use a discard payoff to end the game. But this time I decided to do something a little different for this deck. There are a few different cards that could go in this slot that would close out the game here. Mystic Redaction, Browlin Skyshark Rider, and Windhorn Buccaneer are just a few of them. I think the Redaction is the weakest and Buccaneer the strongest, but you can choose which is right for you. Or maybe think about those really high power win conditions I mentioned earlier to take this up a few levels. This deck is primed to take advantage of everything Sauron has to offer, though curiously enough, Sauron seems to care more about what his armies have to offer than anything else. This was a chaotic build, and with all the different ways we can overlap his abilities, I expect this will be a deck that requires a lot of maintenance as future sets are released and we find more mechanics that will bridge the gaps between his abilities. It's a very well-rounded deck, and I'd be hard-pressed to identify a specific strategic weakness of the deck, but right now, it's almost unavoidable that a deck with a 6-mana commander be a little slower to get rolling, at least in a casual setting. Combo decks can easily get under us and take us out before we're finished setting up. In light of that lack of speed, I rank this Dark Lord 1 for each ring given to the Dwarf Lords, great miners and craftsmen of the Mountain Peak. Special thanks to all my patrons on Patreon. When I started this channel, I wanted to provide insight into deck building decisions with my videos. In practice, what often happens is I talk for 30 minutes about every little nuance of a deck, which is longer than I'm comfortable with posting to YouTube, so a lot of that discussion gets cut for time. Here, patrons can find extended discussions on their favorite decks, in-depth guides on complex game actions, request priority deck techs, and more. So if you enjoy this content, consider becoming a patron today. One of the things my patrons have made possible is a special series of deck techs that I'm really excited to show off to you guys. When I finally get them all uploaded, I'll be giving away a special collection of altars and tokens that I've made, corresponding to each deck on the channel. For example, for the Merkle Lord of Bones deck, the prize is a set of double-faced altars of the most prominent cards in the deck, whose backsides are set in the constellation frame with updated text to show that they're acting as enchantments now. For every 1,000 views on each video, I'll increase the prize pool for that deck. All you have to do to be eligible to win is be subscribed to the channel. If you like this video, the next decks I'll be looking at can be found here in no particular order, so if you see something you like, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss them, and check out the playlist in the top left for more. Thanks for watching!